Unit 1. By midday the sun was so strong that Jim could not go any further. There were no trees near the path, so he took shelter under a big rock. After drinking the rest of his water, he took off his shirt and rolled it into a pillow. Then he lay down on the ground and went to sleep. It was late in the afternoon when he awoke. He was just about to jump up when he felt something moving near his feet. He looked down. A long black snake was just about to crawl across his legs. Jim watched, too terrified to do anything. The snake moved across his legs. It hesitated for a moment, then crawled on and vanished under the rock. Jim leapt to his feet and, pausing only to pick up his shirt, ran off down the path. Unit 2. Tom Smith was a writer. He wrote stories for magazines. One evening he could not find an end for a story. He sat with his typewriter in front of him, but he had no ideas. So he decided to go to the cinema. When he came back, he found that he had had a visitor. Someone had broken into his flat. The man had had a drink, smoked several of Tom's cigarettes, and had read his story. The visitor left Tom a note. "I have read your story, and I don't think much of it. Please read my suggestions, and then you can finish it. By the way, I am a burglar. I am not going to steal anything tonight. But if you become a successful writer, I will return." Tom read the burglar's suggestions. Then he sat down and wrote the rest of the story. He is still not a successful writer, and he is waiting for his burglar to return. Before he goes out in the evening, he always leaves a half-finished story near his typewriter. Unit 3. Fred telephoned his wife. "I've managed to get free tickets for the theatre tonight," he told her. "Meet me outside the office. We'll have something to eat, and then go on to the theatre." Fred's wife was delighted. It was quite a while since they had been to the theatre, which she liked very much. She met her husband as they had arranged. They had dinner and got to the theatre in good time. At the entrance, Fred took out his wallet to get the tickets. "It's very strange," he said. "They aren't here." "Try your pockets," suggested his wife. But the tickets weren't there either. Then Fred looked very embarrassed. "What's the matter?" asked his wife. Well, Fred explained, I remember what I did with the tickets. I put them in my briefcase. But because I wasn't coming home, I left it in the office. Unit 4. Inspector Reed sat in his office, studying the reports on the 3 people who might have stolen the Colonel's collection of rare coins. First, there was Barnes, the man who looked after the Colonel's property. He had been cheating the Colonel for years, and besides, he was badly in debt. Almost certainly he had a set of keys to the house. Next, there was the maid. She seemed honest enough herself, but the inspector had discovered that she was in love with a man who had spent many years in jail. Perhaps she had let him into the house the night the Colonel had been robbed. Finally, there was the Colonel's own son. He had been in trouble even when he was at university. He, too, was in debt. Besides, he could have entered the library, where the collection was kept, at any time. The inspector decided that he must question him again more carefully. Just then there was a knock at the door, and Sergeant Smith burst in. "Sir," he announced dramatically, "the girl has admitted everything." Unit 5. All the housewives who went to the new supermarket had one great ambition: to be the lucky customer who did not have to pay for her shopping. For this was what the notice just inside the entrance promised. It said, "Remember, once a week, one of our customers gets free goods. This may be your lucky day." For several weeks, Mrs. Edwards hoped, like many of her friends, to be the lucky customer. Unlike her friends, she never gave up hope. The cupboards in her kitchen were full of things which she did not need. In vain her husband tried to dissuade her. She dreamed of the day when the manager of the supermarket would approach her and say, "Madam, this is your lucky day. Everything in your basket is free." One Friday morning, after she had finished her shopping and had taken it to her car, she found that she had forgotten to buy any tea. She dashed back to the supermarket, got the tea, and went towards the cash desk. As she did so, she saw the manager of the supermarket approach her. "Madam," he said, holding out his hand, "I want to congratulate you. You are our lucky customer, and everything you have in your basket is free. Unit 6. We have rather a small house, with only one spare bedroom. You can imagine our alarm, then, when Aunt Clara wrote to say that she was coming to stay with her family for the weekend. Her family, I should explain, consists of 4 boys, all under the age of 12. I sent off a telegram at once, protesting that our house was too small. Aunt Clara called us up the next morning. "I forgot to explain," she said in her sweetest voice. "The boys will be bringing a couple of tents." Even so, my wife was far from reassured. It was true we had a large garden, but there was still the problem of feeding 4 growing boys. "And what if it rains?" she demanded. But Saturday morning turned out to be bright and clear when I went to the station to meet Aunt Clara. I managed to squeeze 3 of the boys, together with the luggage, into the back of the car. The youngest sat in front, with Aunt Clara and me. "I didn't see the tents among your luggage," I remarked over my shoulder to David, the eldest boy. "The tents!" exclaimed Aunt Clara. "Heavens! We left them in the luggage van." Unit 7. Lane waited on the bench nearest the bridge, as he had been instructed. The wind blew straight across the river, sharp as a razor, and he had to pull his overcoat closer about him. He went over his instructions in his mind. The agent would appear at 4 o'clock. He would chat to Lane for a while, after which he would get up, leaving his newspaper behind. The plans would be fastened inside. A distant clock began to strike the hour. As if from nowhere, a man appeared and sat down beside Lane, placing his newspaper on the seat between them. He was thin and middle-aged, and seemed in need of a good meal. He bore no resemblance to Lane's idea of a successful spy. His conversation, confined to trivial observations about the weather, was painfully uninteresting. A few minutes later, he got up and continued on his way. Lane picked up the paper which lay on the bench, as if he wanted to look at the news. He was excited to see the plans pinned to the centre page. At that moment, however, there was a strong gust of wind which lifted the newspaper into the air like a kite and blew it into the river. Unit 8. The cinema was in darkness when we went in, and it was no easy matter making our way to our seats. The old man who had come in ahead of us was luckier. He had a stick to help him find his way, like a blind man. "It's very funny not to have any lights on before the film starts," I commented. "And no music either," added my wife. "Well, perhaps they are economizing." We were in one of the rows nearest the entrance. We heard other people pass by, but we could not tell how big the audience was. Obviously, however, the cinema did not get very crowded at that time of day. "It must be 2 o'clock already," my wife said, getting restless. "Can you see your watch?" My eyes had now grown accustomed to the darkness, and by bringing my watch close to my eyes, I could just make out that it was a little after 2. Just then the program started, but we were disappointed to find that there had been a change. The second of the 2 films, which we were not interested in seeing, was being shown first. Unit 9. John had bought a packet of cigarettes just before we caught the train, and he offered me one as we settled ourselves in our compartment. We were on our way back from a camping holiday. We had lived rough for over a fortnight, and even a cigarette was a luxury at that moment. I felt in my pocket for a box of matches, but could not find any. "I haven't got any either," said John. Sitting opposite to us was a man whose face was hidden by a newspaper. "Excuse me, sir," said John, leaning across. "Could you give me a light, please?" The newspaper was lowered to reveal a rather elderly man with a stern face. "This is a no-smoking compartment," the man said. He indicated the notice near the window. We apologized and put away our unlit cigarettes. The man went on, in a rather more kindly fashion, to warn us against the dangers of smoking. "I speak as a doctor," he concluded, and after that he went back to reading his newspaper. When he got out a few stations later, he left his newspaper behind him. We picked it up, eager to find out what had happened while we were on holiday. "Just look at this," remarked John, pointing to a photograph. "It's the man who was sitting opposite us." Underneath the photograph was an account of a lunatic who had recently escaped. It appeared that he liked to pretend to be a doctor. Unit 10. It took George quite a while to find a parking place for his car, and in the end he had to leave it in a narrow street some way from the dentist's. As he got out, he glanced at his watch. His appointment was at 5, and he still had 20 minutes to spare. He crossed into the square and sat down on a bench, partly to enjoy the last of the afternoon sun, but also to calm his nerves. He hated these visits to the dentist. As he sat there, watching the children at play and listening to the old women gossiping, he was taken aback to see a red sports car like his own come out of the street where he had parked. The car gathered speed and was soon lost to sight. George felt in his pockets for his keys. They were not there. "My car!" he exclaimed in a loud voice, which made several people stare at him. He got up and ran across the square, then down the narrow street. His car was not to be seen, but then he discovered it, concealed behind a larger one. He was relieved, too, to find his keys still in his car. By the time he reached the dentist's, it was already after 5. "I had rather an odd experience," he said to the dentist, to explain his lateness. "I thought my car had been stolen." "It's quite all right, sir," said the dentist. "As a matter of fact, I have only just got here myself." Unit 11. The speedboat was about 2 miles off when we first noticed it. We were directly in its path. There were 2 others besides myself in our canoe, which we had hired that morning to cross to the island, where we intended to picnic and spend the day exploring. Our first reaction was to begin paddling as hard as we could, so as to get clear of the speedboat. But it was soon apparent that our efforts served no purpose. "Even if they manage to miss us," observed John gloomily, "the canoe will overturn as the speedboat goes past." I suppose I was more worried than my friends, because I did not know how to swim. Some instinct to survive led me to tear off my shirt put it on the end of my paddle and wave it on high like a flag. But still the speedboat came straight towards us, and I began to pray under my breath. Almost at the last moment, however, the speedboat swerved aside and roared majestically past us at a distance of about 100 yards. Someone in the boat waved to us cheerily, but we were too weak with fear to respond. We sat waiting for our canoe to be overturned. But it never happened. The speedboat passed so lightly over the surface of the lake that the water was barely disturbed. Unit 12. We were all astonished to learn one day that the big house on the hill had at last been sold. It had stood empty for ages, ever since its owner, an eccentric old lady, had died in rather strange circumstances. The matter had never been satisfactorily cleared up. The house had acquired a bad name and was even rumoured to be haunted. Our surprise was even greater when we heard that its new owner, a businessman from London, planned to convert it into a hotel. Shortly afterwards, however, a small army of workmen appeared, and in a short space of time transformed the old ruin. But all this urgent activity came to an abrupt end when a fire broke out one night and considerably damaged the nearly completed hotel. Perhaps the businessman took this as a sign, although it is more likely that the fire cost him a lot of money. At all events, rather to our satisfaction, the big house on the hill was once again allowed to lapse into its former neglected state.